The Society for Vascular Surgery, under the leadership of Richard Cambria and Peter Glavitsky, has initiated an audiovisual interview series with pioneers of vascular surgery. This is part of an effort by SVS to develop archives to preserve the history of SVS as well as vascular surgery as a specialty. A committee was formed called the History Project Work Group, chaired by Jimmy Yao, with Norman Rich and me as members. Cal Ernst served as consultant. Because of the workload, an expansion of this committee was needed. William Baker, Mark Eskandari, Walt McCarthy, William Pierce, Melina Kibbe, and Peter Lawrence were added, as well as Ken Cherry. It is my pleasure today to interview the famous surgeon, Dr. John Ochsner. John, thank you for agreeing to this interview.
Well, thank you. Good to see you again.
Let's start with your early days of when you were born in Madison. What was that like?
Well, I was born in Madison, but only lived there for 3 months before my dad came to New Orleans to be chairman of the Department of Surgery at 30 years of age, the youngest professor of any time. And when I moved to New Orleans, you know, we were still fighting the Civil War as children. And when I was in the first grade, the teacher, you know, would always get up and ask the students their name and then say where you were born. And so I gave my name, and I was basically honest. So I told I was born in Madison, Wisconsin. But I hasten to add that my mother and daddy were there on their honeymoon. So the moral of the story is I'd rather be a bastard than a Yankee.
Now, John, we'll talk about this further later on, but your father was the famous Alton Ochsner, who formed the clinic. Tell us about your dad a little bit, and we'll go back on more detail, but growing up, what was your dad like?
Well, he was a strong disciplinarian, and that was in the age, as you know, that children were whipped when they did something bad. But I can tell you, my dad had a fast belt. He'd have it out if we spilled milk at the table before it hit the table or the floor. That belt was already out.
But I know things changed later.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Now, tell us about your mother.
My mother raised us in every way because we saw Dad every night, though, at dinner. He insisted that we have dinner every night together when he was in town. But it was a little hard because we had to wait till he got home. And that could vary from 6 to 10. And when you're young and trying to study, and study on an empty stomach wasn't very easy. And consequently, you know, it wasn't a happy time for us, except when he got home at 6, which was very rare.
Now, you had several siblings.
Yes, I had 2 brothers and a sister. Both of my brothers, unfortunately, have died. My sister's still alive, and she's moved back to New Orleans, so I see her frequently.
Great. So these were, in many ways, happy days for you.
Oh, yes, my God. All childhood days should be happy, and mine were extremely happy.
Now, for your early education, you went to public school.
Yes.
For grammar school at Audubon School. And then for prep school, in high school, you went
to Darlington in Rome, Georgia.
Was that a good education?
Yes, it was a good education. I was more interested in sports at the time, and to be frank, in New Orleans, we really didn't have any high schools that were very excelled in sports, except for one school, Jesuit, which was a Catholic high school, and we were Protestants, and at that time, you know, there was such a difference between a Protestant and and a Catholic in this community. I mean, the Catholics didn't want their daughters to even date a Protestant boy, but and so I wasn't too keen on going to catechism, so I asked to go to Darlington because I knew some boys that had gone to Darlington, and I wanted to enjoy the sports world that they had. But it was a very good education, I must say. My freshman year at Tulane, but Tulane was quite a bit the repeat of my senior year at Darlington.
Now, during this time, were you thinking about medicine?
No, it was almost, we almost thought we had to be doctors.
So you weren't thinking about it; it was already decided.
Yeah, we just didn't think you did anything else. That's what Daddy did, and we just thought, we wanted to do what Daddy did. But I had no really desire. I wasn't one of those guys that was operating on a cat or something in the back garage, trying to find out what organs were in there, like some people I know.
So you came back for college in New Orleans.
In New Orleans, yeah, I went to Tulane.
At Tulane. And then med school at Tulane.
I was in the war in between.
Right.
World War II.
That's when you were in the Merchant Marines.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, where did you go?
I went to, they have Kings Point Academy, up in New York, and they trained, they had a special, the reason I did it is because I was only 17. I couldn't get into the Army or the V-12 program, and I had to get my dad's permission to actually join. And he wasn't too keen about it, but he knew that I was going to do it anyway because all kids at that time, all people at that time wanted to participate in the war. You didn't want to be a civilian.
Right.
And so they had a course in which they made you a warrant officer, and you were a purser and a pharmacist together. So you took care of the books on the ship, and you also took care of the sick bay.
Okay. So was this lost time, do you think, John? Or
No.
gain
The
something
training
from
was about a 9-month training. It wasn't very long, and then we shipped off usually to the north on the North Atlantic run. Well, we had, at that time, there were quite a few ships were lost, as much as sometimes 30 and 40% of the Merchant Marine ship. They were sitting ducks, but the U-boats were, in their prime. But by the time I went, all that was over. I didn't see any action. I just got seasick.
Now, you came back to intern in 1952 and 53. But this time, you went to the University Hospital in Michigan.
Yeah, I went to University of Michigan.
Why did you?
Well, I just thought it was a nice internship. I knew of some people that had been up there that had preceded me, and they were all happy with it. And it was a great place. It was a wonderful place to live. Ann Arbor was a great college town, probably the greatest college town in America at the time. In fact, they had a budget, the university did, that was bigger than the city of New Orleans. They owned a railroad. They owned a lot of things. But anyway, I wanted to go up there. But once I got there, I realized that Dr. Collar, who was chief, was such a kind man that everybody coming back from the Korean War at that time, everybody coming back would get accepted back into the program. They ended up with about 35 senior residents. Well, my God, how much time did they get to serve on the operative schedule, on the operating service, which was usually in most institutions, on your senior year would be the whole time, and your junior year at least half, if not more. And at Michigan, they were only served 1 month.
Now, Then you did your first year of surgical residency in Michigan.
Yes.
Stayed there for that. During this time, also, you got married.
I got married. No, I met my wife there, but we got married after I left. As soon as I left to go into the Korean War.
Right.
You know, they had when they came and said that I was drafted, I said, wait, I already served. You know, I had 2 years in the Naval Reserve. And they said, well, that doesn't count because this is a doctor's draft. And they said, you may be the only guy that got both.
You got them both, didn't you?
But so I went into the service, but I knew I didn't want to go back to Michigan. So I called Dr. DeBakey, and I knew Dr. DeBakey because he was my dad's student for years and studied with him for 16 years. And he was our babysitter when we were children. And so I knew him well enough by that, at that time I called him Mike, and I called him up and asked him if he'd have a place available for me in the second year program at Baylor. And he said yes, he would. So I went there as soon as I got out of the Korean War.
Now, the primary teaching hospital there was Jeff Davis.
Jeff Davis was the charity hospital we taught in, yeah.
Prior to Ben Taub.
Prior to Ben Taub, yes.
And at that time, surgeons were being trained in a wide variety, cardiothoracic, general surgery, and vascular surgery.
Yeah. Well, there wasn't any cardiac, really, in our general surgery training. It was, but a lot of vascular. And, of course, it was a wonderful time for us because that was when Baylor was practically the only place that was doing the pioneering work in vascular surgery. So we saw all the terrible mistakes that were being made. I remember one of the first patients I saw on the ward when I walked in was a guy who had gangrene from the waist on down after a attempt at a autoiliac endarterectomy or bypass. But they didn't use heparin then. It was all just done as quick as they could, and if it was too long, they clotted everything.
Now, your teachers there were not only Dr. DeBakey, but George Jordan, Stanley Crawford, and a number of other outstanding teachers.
Yes.
What do you remember about that time, John?
Well, I remember everything about it. It was a tough residency. When you were at Jeff Davis, you were on one night and off one night. And when you were on, you were up all night. So, the next night you just kind of hobbled home and went to bed. It was not very nice on a marriage because, you saw the kids for a little while and you couldn't wait to get in bed. And your wife wasn't very happy about that either. But and then you had to spend 3 months on Dr. DeBakey's service. And that was in your junior year. And that's where he kind of weeded out everybody. And he ended up, we started off with 14 and ended up with 2 that would end up being the senior residents. And because everybody wanted that job, the first guy who stayed all 3 months in the hospital had to be followed by the next guy doing the same thing. So I had to spend all 3 months in the hospital, and I never went home for 3 months.
Now, following your training, the completion of your residency, 1959 to 1960, you did a year with Dr. Cooley doing open heart surgery. Now, tell us a little bit about that time, and also, John, was the rivalry between Dr. Cooley and Dr. DeBakey quite as fierce at that time?
It was fierce, but it wasn't known. Dr. DeBakey always called my father Dr. Ochsner. He could never call him, Alton, just like I could never call Dr. DeBakey Mike again. Right. It would always be Dr. DeBakey. And it made Dr. DeBakey very mad when Dad went over one time visiting professor, and Den would call him Alton.
1960 to 61, you stayed at Baylor as an instructor.
Yes.
But
Well, I took my, the thing, how I got on with Den. Den was, you know, second in command, you would say it. He was right behind DeBakey. And he came to me and he said, you know, I'm going to start doing heart surgery next year. And he said, why don't you ask Dr. DeBakey if you can spend your senior year with me? Now, the senior year then was a year that I got both my general surgery and my thoracic surgery boards. You know, we did it on an Excel program. So it was a very important year, and Dr. DeBakey said, yes, but if you do that, then you'll have to come back on the staff and stay with me for a year, which I did. But that was different than now. The boys have to take an extra year or two extra than I had to take at the time. But of course, they have a lot more to learn now than I had. Then there was practically nothing in cardiac surgery. It was mostly thoracic.
now, John, you had the opportunity to stay with Dr. DeBakey or with Dr. Cooley, and yet you decided to come back to the clinic. Why?
For one thing, you know, there were a lot of times I'd be doing things for Dr. DeBakey, doing a little portal cable shunt or something like that on a patient that was coming from the Ochsner Clinic. And I said, you know, I ought to get home because I always wanted to be back at the Ochsner Clinic. And Dr. DeBakey asked me to come over with my wife for dinner, for lunch one Sunday, and we'd discuss it, and we did, and I just had to tell him that I want to go home. And anyway, my wife didn't want to. She liked it there. For one thing, I was making 3 times more than they paid me when I came here.
Now, by this time, John, you were clearly a dual threat. You were certainly at the cutting edge of cardiac surgery, as it was at that time,
Yes.
as well as vascular and general surgery.
Well, I was very lucky. I wrote with, of course, Den's patients the first paper on infant heart surgery of any significance. It was 300 babies under 1 year of age, and gave it at the American Association of Thoracic Surgery. And so that was kind of the beginning of my career in cardiac surgery. But all cardiac surgeons originally were vascular surgeons. We were vascular surgeons that a group of us stayed in cardiac or went to cardiac. Some of us went to both. And then another group, you know, would just go to vascular. Like in my group, Bill Blaisdell was one of my closest friends in training when I was a resident. He was a fellow there. And we took our boards all together. But Bill gave up cardiac right away. He just went into vascular. So I did both almost all my life until it became evident you couldn't do both. And that was probably just in the last 10 years of my practice that I went exclusively to cardiac.
Now, John, I think it's safe to say when you came back to the clinic, you became the star and the driving force. Do you think that's...
At that time, yes, because Dad was not on the cutting edge, of course, as you got to his age, and they really wanted somebody to get cardiac surgery going. Right. They had tried it, and they had such a terrible mortality, they put a moratorium on it.
I'd like now to talk about some specific areas in your career that I'd like for you to discuss and expand on. The first area is the Ochsner Clinic. Tell us about the beginning of the Ochsner Clinic.
Well, it started there were 5 men who were head of their divisions of surgery. Daddy was chairman of the department, the chairman of OBGYN, orthopedics, otolaryngology, and urology.
Okay.
Those 5 gentlemen wanted to form a university-based clinic, Tulane University Clinic. And they went to the Board of Administrators, and the Board of Administrators turned them down, said, no, you couldn't do it. So they said, would you mind if we go ahead and did our own? They said, no, that was fine. And it was at that time when they started it, every member of Ochsner Clinic was also a member of the staff at Tulane.
Okay.
It was a dual appointmentship. And then they went to them, and when they began to grow, they couldn't get anything going with any of the local hospitals with Tulane and Ochsner together. So they asked Tulane, let's build a hospital. And Tulane said, no, we don't want to be in the hospital business. So then they had to go out and get their own hospital. And that was very difficult because the entire medical community in New Orleans fought them. In fact, they sent each one of them 30 pieces of silver in a little leather pouch, the connotation being they were Judas. But anyway, they had a hard time getting a hospital. Every time they would apply for a surplus Army or Navy hospital, a bunch of the doctors in town that were very strong in the veterans group would kill them, you know, say they want it, and then they'd put in a bid, get it, and then just let it fall. Had no intention of doing it this time. But then when they finally came to the one that's out right north of us, near the bridge, came available. Dr. DeBakey at that time was in Washington. Mm-hmm. And so he had enough power. He was at Surgeon General's office. So he went to the VA and told them, don't let the other group have it, you know, give it to the Ochsner group.
The growth of this clinic, even though it was perhaps had some difficulty with initial birth, progress was amazing. Mm-hmm. To become the largest medical practice in the South. Mm-hmm. Now training some 500 medical students a year and 350 graduate students a year.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yeah. We have more than the medical schools now because we have theirs. We're training both the LSU and Tulane residents because a lot of them don't have programs that we have. And now we have a medical school with Queensland University in Brisbane, Australia, which is a very highly ranked medical school, higher ranked by far than anything around this part of the country. And they come here for the last 2 years. They go to Queensland for their basic sciences, and they come over to us for their clinical. And it's worked out very well.
Now, the role of the clinic in healthcare reform, HMOs and so forth, really became evident. While the national healthcare seemed to be driven by cost, the clinic remained driven by quality.
Yes,
you think that's a fair statement?
I know it's a fair statement because they figured out how much the doctors actually put into the building of this clinic, and it's enormous. It was almost like, you know, over $1 million a person over, you know, so many years. You know, during the good times, which were my times, I'm talking about back in the 70s particularly, when we got into coronary artery surgery and things like that, that the fees were enormous compared to today's fees. they were probably 5 times what the guys are getting now. So we made so much money, that, it didn't matter. We were very happy. We weren't getting big salaries. We never got paid as much as our counterpart in general, in private practice. But we had the nicety of having all specialties around us, and if you needed any help from, renal problems, cerebral, anything, you pushed a button and you had somebody there. We've grown now to an institution that has 8 hospitals, 35 clinics, and we're about a $4.5 billion a year institution.
Wow. Now, I know that the spheres of influence for the clinic were not just the hospital and the clinic. Incidentally, the first hospital was called the Splinter Village, is that right?
Well, yeah, it was Ochsner Foundation Hospital, but they called it the Splinter Village because it was a wooden barracks, and it was all on stilts.
And you couldn't walk barefooted on the
No.
floor.
But that little place, believe it or not, had some great people. Gary Cooper was operated on there. Ben Hogan was operated on there. A lot of people, had to stay there because that's all they had. And they did 2 other things that people don't know. They had the first recovery room,
Right.
which then became an intensive care unit. And then they formed the first family waiting room,
Right.
where people came out to talk to the family. The doctor came out to talk to the family after the operation. And those are 2 things that every hospital in this country has.
Right. But pioneered there.
We had the first one, yeah. And that was Splinter Village, not any of the new buildings.
Also, besides the clinic and the hospital, additional attention, if not equal attention, was paid to teaching in all medical areas as well as research.
Yeah, the 3 things are research and teaching and then clinical care, yeah.
Now, 2 additional areas for discussion related to the clinic. John, anytime we talk about the clinic, we have to talk about your dad. He was the first to do a transfusion in Europe, I understand, while he was on tour there as a young surgeon, became professor of surgery at Tulane, probably the youngest ever, at 30 years of age, succeeding the great Mattis,
Yes.
the legendary pioneer of vascular surgery. Now, your dad loved teaching, is that right?
He'd rather teach than do anything. He really did. He did some legendary things in teaching. He formed or pioneered what is called the bullpen, where a student is given a patient to examine for a short period of time, an hour or something like that, take a history, physical and all, and then presented in an amphitheater to Dad. And Dads would usually, every time they'd say something, he'd say why or how or, whatever it was. And everybody was just scared to death of it. 2 guys fainted while they were taking their exam. and he'd always poke them on the lapel, like this.
So that's where Dr. DeBakey learned that.
But anyway, he did that, and he didn't believe in textbooks. He said, particularly at that time, by the time a textbook was printed, when it went through the various forms, it was outdated.
Too late.
Yeah. Nowadays, with computers and printers, they have no trouble getting the book out in a few months after it's finished. But so he did didactic lectures. And then he got to where they had a couple of students that learned shorthand. And they would go in there and shorthand the entire lecture, send it out, get it typed, and then you could buy it from him, the rest of the students. Boy, he hated that. He hated that. But he would never, he wouldn't allow anybody to be late either. He was, very prompt in everything. And if a student came in late, he'd make him come up, sit in the front row, and then he'd tell him, he said, he said, only bankers come in late. Doctors come early.
Now, also, he was one of the first to make a connection between smoking.
He was the first.
Cancer of the lung.
Yeah.
And took a great deal of heat for that position.
Oh, all this. Dr. Graham, at Washington University.
Evarts Graham.
Graham, who did the first pneumonectomy, and was a smoker, and was my dad's professor. And he wrote Dad one time and said, Al, you've got to get off this kick about smoking. He said, your colleagues will begin to think you're a kook.
Really?
Yeah, and Dad wrote him back. He said he didn't care what his colleagues said. He knew he was right. And he said, Dr. Graham, you better quit smoking yourself or you're going to get cancer of the lung. And not long after he did, and he wrote Dad back again, I wish I'd have listened to you.
Now, he was also very much of a pioneer in thromboembolic venous disease, and did one of the most famous operations of caval ligation on a very famous athlete.
Yeah, Ben Hogan.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, how did Ben Hogan end up?
Well, he was a bus hit him out in El Paso, and he went over to the side to protect Valerie, his wife, and the steering wheel got his pelvis, and it was just shattered. And so he started throwing emboli. And so they called the guys in from Mayo Clinic who heparinized him, tried to stop the emboli, but it didn't happen. He kept throwing more and more. So they said, well, your cava's got to be ligated. And the guys at Mayo said that the best guy to do it would be John Ochsner, because he had done so many of them. And so they sent a B-52 after him, and to pick him up. And I know he came into my room to get a suitcase to take with him, and he asked me, he said, I've got to go operate on a famous golfer, they say. Do you know anybody named Ben Hogan? And I said, of course, Dad. He's the greatest golfer. And he said, well, I never heard of him. But anyway, they put him in the front turret. When they were getting ready to land at El Paso, they kept going around. He saw fire trucks out there. And all. They couldn't get the wheels down. And they had to land right on him. But they finally got him down. They pumped him down manually. The hydraulic system wasn't working. And so anyway, he had to give him some vitamin K and a few things over a day or so, and then he went ahead and operated on him, and that was it.
He did well and made a great comeback.
Yeah.
Now, also, one of the things that I think most people don't realize about your dad was that he initiated racial integration in the hospital in 1947.
Yeah, everybody thought my dad was such a conservative man, and he was in his political, in the political arena. In fact, they tried to get him to run for some offices, which I kept telling him below his dignity. Don't even think about it. But he did certain things. Like when the hospital was started, he said, somebody said, well, will you take in charity patients? He said, of course, this hospital will be integrated from day one. Anybody can come.
I'm not sure that's a radical point of view. I think that's very conservative. I think that's wonderful.
Well, yeah. Well, of course, at that time it was very liberal.
Also, John, he was a founding member of the American Board of Surgery and also the American Board of Thoracic Surgery.
Yes.
Helping to start these two wonderful organizations, as well as being president of SVS 1947?
I guess it was, yeah. I don't know, yeah.
And Wrecks of Mardi Gras
48.
in 1948. John, talk a little bit about your role in the development and evolution of the Ochsner Clinic.
Well, my role was when I came to really get cardiac surgery and vascular surgery going. And I was smart enough to know that they'd had so many deaths and nobody wanted. I'd hear rumors when I came in that if that young guy thinks he's going to come in, start vascular surgery, cardiac surgery again, he's nuts. And I had a hard time getting an anesthesiologist to put anybody asleep. And I had to, of course, get a team up, somebody to run a pump and get a pump. One that was, like a K Cross that I thought we could do something with reasonable, good results. So I taught a guy who was just a high school graduate, but smart as hell, with just a bucket out. And I'd put the venous lines in the buckets, and then I'd squeeze one on and off just to get him used of the reservoir going up and down. And we finally got it going. And the next thing I did, I said, I'm going to pick my cases early to make sure that, we're going to get through. But, you couldn't pick a lot because there weren't a lot of cases, that a lot of people wanted to do the same thing. But I went and I know I did 68 consecutive cases without a death. And by that time, everybody, when I got to about the 50, everybody was perfectly happy with, heart surgery at the time. And so we went on from there and never had any trouble and did a lot of things first.
Now, you also brought modern vascular surgery to the clinic.
Yes.
Arterial surgery in particular.
Well, Paul DeCamp was here, and Paul DeCamp was a well-known vascular surgeon. In fact, he was secretary of the Society of Vascular Surgery for a while. But Paul, aneurysms, when I got here, it was an all-day affair and not with good results. And so I remember he asked me shortly after I got in to come in to help him do an aneurysm. And of course I did, but I said I'd do it only under one condition, that I do it and you watch me. Because I'm not used to somebody, of watching somebody else, except for Dr. DeBakey.